I'd like to welcome you to this latest meeting of the Association for Cypriot, Greek and Turkish Affairs. It gives me great pleasure this evening to introduce Andreas Constandinos. Andreas is, well, a newly minted PhD, so congratulations to him. I think, what is it, 2-3 weeks now?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, settling into it. His title of his talk this evening is America, Britain and the Cyprus Crisis of 1974, Calculated Conspiracy or Foreign Policy Failure. I don't think you get much more interesting than this, and topical and controversial, needless to say. By way of background, Andreas was born in Britain of Greek, Cypriot and German ancestry. He studied law at university and then qualified as a barrister at law at the Middle Temple. In 2005 to 2008, he carried out research in the Cyprus crisis of 1974 at the University of East Anglia, and he successfully completed his PhD in modern European history. University. Andreas, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Andreas Constandinos, and as James has just said, I've just recently completed my PhD at the University of East Anglia. I decided to tackle a very straightforward, non-controversial topic, Cyprus in 1974. But before I start to talk about my thesis, I thought I'd very briefly tell you a little bit about myself. James has done a bit of an introduction, but if I've learned one thing from history in the last few years is that what is incredibly important is to know your source, so that when you're reading someone's book or reading a document, you need to understand who the author is, what his motivation is for saying what he's saying, and where he's getting his information from. So I thought I'd do you the same courtesy. So as you've heard, my name is Andreas Constandinos. Well, my grandfather was from Cyprus. My father was born here in England, and I was also born here in London, just 10 minutes down the road. I'm of mixed ancestry. My mother is German, and I've never lived in Cyprus. So as a result of that, I've had, in the last 3 years, people say to me that I couldn't possibly be in a position to write about Cyprus because I've never lived there. And then the flip side is that because I have a Greek Cypriot name, by definition, anything that I write has to be Greek Cypriot propaganda. So I've sort of had both allegations thrown at me. Now, obviously, I'm going to refute both of those and say that because I've never lived in Cyprus and because I personally don't know anyone who became a refugee in 1974 or who was killed or hurt during the fighting, I think I've been able to approach a very sensitive and emotional subject objectively, and I hope that you'll agree when you listen to me speak. My motivation is a personal one. Before I knew anything about 1974, I never understood, when I spoke to Cypriots, how I could get completely different versions of what happened in 1974. And I think because I'm half German and you're taught ad nauseum about the Second World War, I couldn't understand how all these different people would tell you different stories of one particular event in history. So I wanted to find out for myself and try to separate fact from fiction, if you like. And I was lucky because when I started the PhD, it coincided with the opening of the archives in Britain and America. So I trawled my way for 2.5 years through all the documents, dusty documents in Kew and in Washington, and I tried to supplement that with all sorts of other material that's out there: National Security Archive material, CIA material, congressional reports, newspapers from Britain, from America, from Greece, from Turkey, from Cyprus, from all over the place. I spoke to people, politicians in Cyprus, officials in America and officials in Britain, and I've tried to put it all together to try and make sense of 1974. Okay, so what am I going to talk to you about today? Well, my supervisor would be very concerned if I could condense 3 years' worth of research into a talk of 40 minutes. And as you all know, Cyprus is an incredibly complex subject, and I actually find my talk somewhat unsatisfactory because it's so complex, and there's so much I'd like to say to you. I'd like to spend all evening with you, but I'm sure you all have better things you'd like to do on your Friday night, so I'll try and condense it. But essentially what I was looking at was whether or not Britain and America were involved in a conspiracy in 1974. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room are aware of the existing literature on the subject, most notably the O'Malley and Craig book, or authors like Christopher Hitchens, who have argued that there was a conspiracy in 1974. Then you get people like Lawrence Stern, or more recently Claude Nicolette, who have argued that it was a failure of diplomacy that led to the crisis in 1974. So I'm going to talk to you today about what was Britain's interest in Cyprus, what were America's interests in Cyprus, what was their involvement in the coup, what was their involvement in the invasion, and I'll start by looking at the two protagonists as far as Britain and America are concerned, British Foreign Secretary James Callaghan and American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Some of you may have noticed that I used the word invasion as opposed to intervention a moment ago. I know that the terminology that surrounds the Cyprus problem is almost as emotive as the actual subject itself, and throughout my thesis I've tried to explain why I've used certain words in certain places. The reason I use the word invasion is because although I think initially there are legal arguments to say that Turkey intervened in Cyprus, Turkey had a right to restore constitutional order, and as we now know, that is not what happened, and therefore the intervention became an invasion, in my opinion, which is also the interpretation of 191 member states of the United Nations. It's also the interpretation of British law courts and the European Court of Human Rights. So that's the terminology I'm going to use. I hope that's clear. All right, so let me introduce you first of all to James Callaghan. He became British Foreign Secretary in March 1974. And the Cyprus crisis was his first major international crisis. When he became Foreign Secretary, he said that he had two priorities. One was to re-establish good relations with Washington, because the previous British government under Edward Heath, the relations had suffered. So he wanted good relations with America, and he also wanted good relations within the Commonwealth. So the Cyprus crisis challenged both of those quite nicely. What is very important in understanding Callaghan's approach to the special relationship is the so-called Suez effect. And I'm sure I don't need to tell people in this room what the Suez crisis was, but essentially it was the last time that British foreign policy went down a different route to that of America, and it ended in disastrous consequences. And Callaghan talks about this quite a lot. He talks about it in his memoirs, and it crops up in a lot of the documents in 1974. So just to bear that in mind. And finally, and this is Kissinger's assessment of Callaghan. Callaghan personalised foreign policy a lot. He expected a lot from his contemporaries. He felt let down and angered when people engaged in duplicitous behaviour, whereas Kissinger said that he was more of a realist and he expected people to let him down. So that was a key difference between the two of them. But that brings me nicely to arguably one of the most controversial and intriguing characters of the 21st century, Heinz Alfred Kissinger. When we talk about Kissinger in a contemporary context, it's also often in a very negative manner. He's often described as a war criminal. But if you go back to the 1970s and you look at old newspapers and you look at TV footage, you'll find that, Kissinger was considered a diplomatic genius at the time. He was a Nobel Prize winner. He was voted the most admired person in the United States. He dated Hollywood actresses. He coined the phrase, "Power is the ultimate aphrodisiac," and for anyone who's seen a picture of him, they'll know that that's definitely true. He was a real celebrity at the time. But what made him controversial was his approach to foreign policy, this idea of realpolitik. Kissinger once very famously said that he would rather live in a world of injustice and order rather than disorder and justice. And he attributed this to his experiences of growing up in Germany. He was born in Germany, but he was Jewish, and his family fled Nazi Germany in 1938 for the United States. Several members of his family were killed during the Holocaust, and this obviously did, although he doesn't really talk about it, obviously did have an influence on his approach to how he would conduct his foreign policy. He used to say things like, people with real responsibility for peace in the world cannot afford a concept such as idealism. He would say, I'm not concerned with what the editorial of the New York Times says about me. My concern is a balance of power in the world and peace and stability in the world. And this is my PhD. His PhD was about this thick. It was one of the longest PhDs anyone's ever written, and I actually read somewhere that that's why Harvard imposed word limits, because it was so long. And he wrote about the balance of power in post-Napoleonic Europe and looked at figures like Metternich. So this framed his approach to foreign policy. And when he became Secretary of State, he was arguably the most influential Secretary of State that America has ever had, because he was simultaneously National Security Advisor. He sat on various National Security Council committees, including the 40 Committee, which oversaw all covert intelligence operations. So he was at the forefront of not just American foreign policy, but also American intelligence. And a very eminent American historian has actually dubbed this period the Nixon-Kissinger presidency. And I think you could argue that in 1974, when Nixon was so consumed by Watergate, that it was almost the Kissinger presidency. So that's how influential he was. He wasn't just influential, he was also he's a very intelligent man, also a very arrogant man. And when he used to talk about State Department officials, CIA officials, he used to talk very condescendingly and with an element of disdain in his voice, so that ultimately what happened was that he conducted foreign policy from the White House. It became almost a one-man show. Whilst his predecessors had travelled less and delegated more, Kissinger ended up travelling more and delegating less. So he would spend most of his time on a plane, flying between Washington and Cairo, Damascus, and he'd get all the information from whatever was going on in the world sent to him on this plane. And the Washington Post actually called this plane the biggest permanent floating foreign policy establishment in history. So that gives you an idea as to how he conducted foreign policy. Also, what is very important is that Kissinger didn't like to associate himself with negotiations that he felt couldn't have a positive outcome. So, for example, I'm not sure how many people in this room are aware that there was supposed to be a third Geneva conference on Cyprus, but because the relations between Greece, Turkey and Cyprus were so poor after the invasion, when Britain approached Kissinger to see whether they could get the conference off the ground, Kissinger had no interest whatsoever, and it was partly due to that the conference never got off the ground. In fact, there's an interesting conversation where Kissinger is speaking to Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, and they're trying to they're discussing an American proposal on an agreement that the Egyptians can reach with the Israelis, and he's saying, "Look, Anwar, I'm going to show you the proposal. If you like it, we'll call it the Kissinger plan. If you don't like it, we'll call it the Cisco plan." Cisco was one of his officials. So that was very much Kissinger's approach. All right, Britain's interests in Cyprus. They can be summarised very quickly. The sovereign base areas and the retained sites that were scattered across Cyprus. These were the only interests that really Britain had. Britain showed very, very little interest in what was going on domestically in Cyprus. In fact, Edward Heath once said that the absence of a solution on Cyprus was of great benefit to Britain, because as long as the two communities are arguing, they can't make a concerted effort to finally, throw the British off the island. So Britain were very happy with the status quo and showed little interest in what was going on domestically. Also, unlike America, Britain wasn't overly concerned with the stability of NATO in that sense. Britain didn't have strategic interests in Greece and Turkey like the United States did. In fact, Britain had very, very little influence in this part of the world, period. And if I was going to summarise Britain's position in this part of the world, I'd use a phrase that Callahan uses throughout the crisis, namely responsibility without power, because Britain was the former colonial master and had signed various treaties during the 1960 agreements. Britain had responsibilities when the crisis erupted, but Britain simply didn't have the power and the influence in the world to live up to those responsibilities, and we'll see how that affects the crisis in a moment or two. Anyway, it's slightly more juicy when we go across the Atlantic. So what were America's interests? Well, I think it's very important to distinguish the Johnson and the Nixon administration, because the idea that Makarios was the Castro of the Mediterranean, or that Cyprus could become the Cuba of the Mediterranean, very much belonged to the Johnson administration. You hardly ever find it in any papers to do with the Nixon administration. In fact, Makarios visited the White House in the early 70s and sat with Nixon and Kissinger and said, "Look, all right, we do have a non-aligned foreign policy, but we are essentially a pro-Western country. I've never appointed a communist to a significant post in my government, and Cyprus could simply never become a communist country because the Cypriots are simply far too religious." And this was taken on board. It definitely was taken on board by Nixon and Kissinger. As far as direct interests in Cyprus were concerned, there's only really one, but it's worth mentioning. It's the fact that America had these 4 facilities, communication facilities, dotted around the island, And in 1968, Washington reached an agreement with Makarios. You can read the agreement in Washington. They paid $1.4 million a year for to use these facilities. And the assessment from within Washington was that as long as Makarios remains in power, we are guaranteed continued use of these facilities. So his presence was actually welcomed in this sense. Now, Kissinger and Makarios had an interesting relationship. There's no question that the concept of having an archbishop as your head of state was anathema to people in Washington. But at the same time, Kissinger did have a grudging respect for Makarios. He called him a big leaguer. He said he was too big for such a small island. And the general assessment was that this man's stature, this man's charisma, far exceeded that of any Greek or Turkish contemporary politician. And in fact, the domestic support that he had was Greek and Turkish politicians were envious because this is something that they simply didn't have. Kissinger was well aware that Makarios was quite a shrewd negotiator himself. And he's having a conversation one day with George Mavros, the Greek foreign minister, and Mavros says, you've got to be careful, this Makarios, he's quite tricky, And he says, I never forget that Greek Prime Minister Karamanlis signed the same 1960 independence agreement as Makarios did, but when Karamanlis returned to Athens, he was branded a traitor, whereas when Makarios, who signed exactly the same agreement, comes back to Nicosia, he's greeted by half the island as a hero. So he was very shrewd and he knew how to sort of play the political game, if you like. But the general assessment from within Washington was that Makarios brought an element of stability to an otherwise precarious part of the world, that he kept the very, very powerful Communist Party Akel in check, and that he didn't harm direct US interests. When America approached Britain for the first time in 1970 to use the sovereign bases, Britain was very wary because they were concerned with America's pro-Israeli foreign policy. They didn't want to upset the Arab world, and they said, well, we're not so sure. If Makarios is not happy with it, then we're not happy with it, because the British government also relied on the goodwill of the Cyprus government for a lot of the facilities they used. But Makarios was quite happy with that. He had no problem with America using the sovereign bases. He also cooperated with America in allowing hostages from the Middle East come over to Cyprus. So there was a fairly good working relationship that existed between Washington and Nicosia in 1974. But what does strike you when you read the documents during the crisis is that Kissinger knew absolutely nothing about Cyprus itself, absolutely nothing. And when I first read this, I thought, this is frightening, this man doesn't know anything at all. But then I realized that it's unrealistic to expect him to know anything. And he certainly isn't the first Secretary of State who knew nothing about Cyprus, and he won't be the last Secretary of State that knows nothing about Cyprus. And the problem wasn't that he didn't know anything about Cyprus, the problem was that officials in the State Department who were responsible for Cyprus, for Greece, for Turkey, who did know what was going on in these countries, that he didn't listen to them. And we'll see how that affects the crisis in a moment or two. Okay, the coup. What was Britain's involvement in the coup? Again, I think on this I can be fairly succinct because there is no evidence, there is nothing anywhere in the archives that suggests that Britain even knew there was going to be a coup, that they had any involvement in the coup. Finding out anything about British intelligence is incredibly difficult. In that sense, Britain is a far more closed society than America, for example, where it's far more easy to find out things about American intelligence. But I think because of Britain's previously damaging policies in Cyprus, there's always this suspicion about British motives. But as I said, there is nothing there to suggest that Britain had any reason at all to collude with Greece in overthrowing Makarios. I have heard the argument that because in 1972 the British government was presented with a bill for £76.5 million in back payments for the use of the facilities on the island, that this could have been a motivation for overthrowing Makarios. If you can go to the archives in Kew and you can read the negotiations verbatim almost, and you'll see that they are conducted very cordially, and I think this suggestion is fairly nonsensical. There is one other argument that I've come across which is actually linked to the United States, but it's linked to the basis, so I'll mention it now. It's that in 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Britain denied America access to the bases, and that Kissinger therefore decided to collude with Turkey to partition the island so that he would have access to Turkish bases in the north. Again, there is no evidence for this at all. It presupposes that American relations with Turkey are better than those with Britain, which certainly wasn't the case in 1974. And if we look at all the crises in the Middle East that have taken place since 1974, you'll see that America actually continues to use the sovereign bases. It used them during the Gulf War in the 90s, it used them during the recent invasion of Iraq, it used them during the recent conflict between Lebanon and Israel. And there is even a suggestion, I can't go into it, unfortunately we don't have enough time, but there is even a suggestion, because Britain actually wanted to withdraw from the bases in 1974, and it was largely down to Kissinger that they remained in Cyprus. That is a fact. What isn't 100% is, but there is a suggestion that America possibly guaranteed itself access to the bases by making some kind of financial contribution. But anyway, this argument doesn't really, there's no evidence for it at all. But, United States. For all the conspiracy lovers out there, I'm going to throw you a bone. Why would the United States be involved in a coup against Makarios? Well, in 1973, the United States, we know, was to some extent, or the CIA was to some extent involved in the overthrow of the democratically elected Marxist leader of Chile, Salvador Allende. Ioannidis himself, the man who was running the junta at the time, said that the CIA had told him that the Americans would acquiesce in a coup against Makarios. In 1964 and in 1967 it had been the United States which prevented Turkey from invading, so why didn't they do it in 1974? And finally, there were two investigations launched into to examine Ioannidis' involvement in the coup, and they were both indefinitely postponed, and there is a suggestion that this was done because the Americans put pressure on the Greeks to postpone them because they would have uncovered CIA involvement in the coup. So just very briefly, what was the situation in Greece? Well, as I'm sure you all know, as of 21st of April 1967, there was a military junta running Greece. This original junta was overthrown in 1973 by a second junta, which was led by Dimitrios Ioannidis. The United States didn't really care if it was Ioannidis, if it was Papadopoulos, if it was Andreas Constandinos, they didn't care. As long as Greece fulfilled their obligations with Nato and fulfilled their bilateral agreements with the United States, they didn't care who was running the show. The United States had approximately 10,000 military personnel and their families stationed in Greece at the time. The US 6th Fleet, which was the fleet station in the Eastern Mediterranean, incredibly strategically important for the United States, had its home porting rights in Piraeus. So there are lots of reasons why Greece was an important ally for the United States. But as far as this new regime was concerned, Kissinger himself described them as of doubtful competence. The CIA called them narrowly nationalistic and parochial, and the general assessment was that these people were so incompetent that they wouldn't stay in power for very long. What did the State Department know about Ioannidis' plans for Cyprus? Well, we know quite a lot. We know that as of February 1974, the State Department was receiving information via the CIA in Athens that Ioannidis was funding extremists in Cyprus, so Iokavita, to first unsettle and then to ultimately topple Makarios. And we know that this information was coming from a Greek CIA official in Athens. Now what we need to understand is the bizarre dichotomous relationship that existed between Greece and the United States. Ioannidis, who was running the junta, wasn't a politician. He was the head of the Greek military police. He was essentially a policeman. The Greek Prime Minister, the Greek President and the Greek Foreign Minister, the formal government of Greece that corresponded with the American Embassy, the American Ambassador and the American government, had no power. Ioannidis didn't talk to the American Ambassador. In fact, he told him he didn't want to see him officially at all, and he expressed serious reservations about meeting him covertly. He spoke exclusively to the CIA. As far as he was concerned, the CIA was the American government. So this is a very strange situation, because Ioannidis is telling the CIA that he's funding extremists in Cyprus, whereas the formal Greek government is saying, we don't want anyone to interfere in Cyprus, we believe in the intercommunal talks, we want good relations with Turkey. So you've got two different statements coming from Greece. When the State Department started to receive this information, and when I say State Department, I mean the man who was in charge of the Cyprus desk, the man who was in charge of the Greek desk, and the man who was in charge of the Turkish desk. These three officials said, well, we need to send a message back, and we need to say that the American government opposes any such activity, because an overthrow of Makarios would lead to a Turkish invasion, and this could lead to war between Greece and Turkey. This would destabilize NATO, and the only country that would benefit from this is Moscow. This is against American policy. We need to let them know. But these three officials wanted this message sent back through the same channel. This was opposed on every single level within the American administration. The Defense Department opposed it because they didn't want to upset the Greeks because they have their important home porting rights in Piraeus. So no, we don't want to upset the junta. The CIA didn't want it because they had exclusive access to the man who was running Greece. So we don't want to upset him either. So no. The State Department itself, higher officials within the State Department, they didn't want it either because they said, well, the State Department of the United States doesn't communicate official American policy through some low-level CIA official that we've never even met. So no, we're not doing that. And most importantly, the White House also didn't want to have anything to do with it because they didn't want to upset the junta either. Why didn't they want to upset the junta? Well, at this point, I need to introduce you to another man, a man called Thomas Pappas, who was an expatriate Greek-American millionaire, businessman who, like people like Onassis, benefited greatly from the tax concessions that had been put in place by the junta. So he was a big supporter of the junta. He wanted the junta, he wanted to keep the junta in power, and he wanted to deflect all criticism of the junta. And he used to write, and you can find these letters in the archives in Washington. He used to write to Nixon and say, I think you need to meet with our ambassador, his name was Henry Tasker, because there's a lot of criticism coming our way at the moment, I don't like it. And Nixon would do this. He would meet with the ambassador and they would discuss how to deflect the criticism, because the junta was a pariah within NATO and within Europe. The only country that had any kind of cordial relationship with the junta was the United States. So there is a suggestion that Pappas funded the Nixon campaign. There's no documentary evidence, but there is a suggestion that that's what he did. There is evidence to support the fact that it was Pappas who was instrumental in getting Agnew appointed as vice president. Agnew, of course, born Agnostopoulos, and it was also Pappas who got Henry Tasker put in the embassy in Athens because he knew that this man, he would be a friend of the juntas and he would deflect any criticism. So Pappas, he acted as a go-between between the Nixon government, the administration, and the junta, and he was described by Nixon and Kissinger as a supporter and a friend of the White House. So you have this very strange scenario between Greece and America, where American interests, which were substantial in Greece, depended on their non-interference in anything that the junta deemed internal Greek affairs, and Ioannidis deemed Cyprus internal Greek affairs. So nothing was done. So March goes by, April goes by, we're now in May, and now by May, Ioannidis has actually told the CIA that he can remove Makarios within 24 hours. He doesn't need a Yokubita to help him, and he believes that Turkey, who he hasn't contacted, will acquiesce quite happily because they hate Makarios just as much as he hates Makarios. Now the State Department, again, these three officials are of the firm belief that what he's doing, he's testing us. He wants to see, what does America think of this? And the fact that we haven't said anything, clearly that means he's going to think, well, this is American acquiescence. They haven't said anything. No message has been sent back. Again, no message is sent back. They try again. There's all this opposition. Eventually, by the end of, by early June, they managed to finally get a message put together, which is seriously watered down. They're not happy with it at all. But they get this message formulated and it gets sent. It doesn't get sent back through the same channel. It goes to the embassy. The ambassador is not allowed to meet Ioannidis, the man who's actually in charge. And also, very importantly, the message talks about an avoidance of fighting between the Greeks and the Turks. Now, Ioannidis was of the firm belief that if he launched a coup, Turkey wouldn't invade. So he realized that there would only be fighting amongst the Greeks. So again, this message could easily have been interpreted as American acquiescence because they're just paying lip service. This wasn't a serious message. It wasn't sent back through the same channel. It wasn't a strong message at all. And it doesn't say anything about avoiding fighting amongst the Greeks. Then the messages that are coming from the CIA change. In early July, all of a sudden the CIA says, oh, Ioannidis has told us that he's changed his mind. He's not going to move against Makarios. There won't be a coup. A document arrives in the State Department on the 3rd of July. Then the same document again arrives almost 2 weeks later on the 12th of July. And the interpretation that the State Department makes of this retrospectively is that Ioannidis did this deliberately. As I'm sure people in this room are aware, there were previous assassination attempts against Makarios. There was one in 1970, for example, when it was the American embassy in Nairobi that had actually warned Makarios. They had information that there was going to be an attempt on his life, and they warned him when he was in Kenya. Ioannidis was a member of the junta at the time. A lot of people believe he was also behind this assassination attempt. So there is a suggestion that Ioannidis didn't want a repeat of this and therefore deliberately gave this wrong information to the CIA, which was then transmitted to the State Department. So when the Cyprus desk officer comes to work on the 15th of July, the day of the coup, he has two documents on his desk. One document is from the CIA, which says Ioannidis has changed his mind, there's not going to be a coup. And the second document, which says there's been a coup in Cyprus, the presidential palace is in flames and Makarios is dead. All right, how do we evaluate this? Well, there is no suggestion that there was a grand conspiracy involving the American government in a coup against Makarios. Naturally, there are still documents that haven't been released. There are still documents which are going to be released in the next coming years, and there may well be documents that contradict what I've written and what I'm saying now, but I don't think so. There is a suggestion that individual CIA officers, possibly Greek-American CIA officers, did give Ioannidis the wrong impression, but more logically, it was the conduct of the United States government that gave Ioannidis the impression that there was going to be American acquiescence. The failure to respond to Ioannidis, the failure to respond in the same manner to Ioannidis, the fact that it was the CIA that exclusively spoke to Ioannidis. And there is some documentary evidence to support this. After the crisis, the American embassy is completely overhauled. The ambassador is replaced, a new ambassador is sent out. He says, look guys, the CIA station needs to be completely overhauled as well. It's running the show like CIA stations used to in the 50s in Southeast Asia and South America. So there's a complete overhaul in Athens. And there's a conversation which you can read in the archives in Washington between the US Secretary of Defense and Kissinger, where the US Secretary of Defense says to Kissinger that his staff went to Athens and discovered what he called weaknesses in the American embassy in Athens, which he believes gave Ioannidis the impression that the Americans would agree to a coup. Large chunks of this document remain sanitized, but Kissinger's response is declassified, and it says that, well, if that's true, then I have a basis for doing something. And my interpretation of that is that his basis for doing something was the complete overhaul of officials who basically weren't doing their job properly, because the American embassy in Athens basically had no idea what the actual government in Greece was doing, because they were completely kept out of the loop. Kissinger also, and I'm going to read this quote, he says to his staff at one point during the crisis, but if any actions were taken against Makarios by any American officials, which I do not believe occurred, it was against our instructions and it was against our convictions. There are various interpretations of that. There is one interpretation that simply because all these rumours are flying around, Kissinger feels the need to simply say, no, we weren't involved. But I think there's also a second interpretation, namely the fact that there was this awareness that there were weaknesses, that there were potentially individual officials who weren't doing their job properly, and that Kissinger just felt compelled to make this statement. But more importantly, I think that the failure comes from the fact that the man who was running American foreign policy, Henry Kissinger, conducted his foreign policy in a very autocratic way, and simply didn't listen to the advice that the officials in the State Department were giving, because if the information and the advice that these officials were giving had been heeded, and if a strong message had been sent to Ioannidis, and if he'd been made aware of the fact that the US government's official policy was against a coup, then arguably the humanitarian crisis that later took place in Cyprus could have been avoided. There is a lot more I would like to say, and I'm sure if anyone has any questions at the end, please ask, but I think that's about all the time. I've probably gone on too long already that I can say about the coup, because obviously I'm going to talk about the invasion now. Again, for the conspiracy lovers out there, I'm really sorry, but whilst the coup might be slightly nebulous, the invasion isn't. There is no evidence, there is nothing whatsoever to suggest that either Britain or America were involved or colluded with Turkey in the invasion of Cyprus. In fact, it's quite the contrary. It's almost comical, the complete lack of knowledge that the Americans had of Turkish movements, Turkish intentions and Turkish objectives, and I'll read something to you later on. After the coup, Britain contacted Washington and said, look, what we need to do is we need to get the Greek National Guard officers off the island, because if we do that, then we eliminate the pretext to invade. The United States had no interest in doing this whatsoever, because they didn't want to upset, as we've seen, we don't want to do anything that upsets the Greeks. But what they do is that they send an official out to the Eastern Mediterranean to try and see if he can get the Greeks to withdraw these officers, or if he can get Turkey to say, no, we're not going to invade. But it's Joseph Sisko is the official, but he's sent empty-handed. I call it mission impossible in my thesis, because he's not given any support really by Kissinger, and there's actually a document where Kissinger admits that he's sending him empty-handed. There's nothing this man can do. But Kissinger still feels it's important that he's sent out there because it's good for American credibility to be seen that we're at least doing something. What was the difference to 64 and 67 when America did prevent Turkey from invading? Well, America did tell Turkey that they opposed a military operation, but they didn't threaten Turkey as they had previously. There was no repeat of the Johnson letter from 64, because Kissinger said that the Johnson letter had been a diplomatic mistake. He thought it was a ridiculous thing to do. Turkey was geopolitically indispensable to the United States. They were a barrier between the Soviet Union and the Arab world. He also said there was no legitimate government in Cyprus. The government in Greece is an international outcast. He felt that there was nothing he could do. In fact, after the crisis, he said that the only thing that could have prevented Turkey from invading was a show of force from the United States. And this is something he simply wasn't going to do. It would set a very dangerous precedent as far as America's relations with Israel, for example, are concerned. And the bottom line is that Turkey occupying northern Cyprus wasn't against American interests, because as long as the Greeks could be prevented from going to war with Turkey, NATO wouldn't be affected, the stability of NATO wouldn't be affected, and therefore it wasn't in the against American interests. So to translate this into Kissinger's sort of realpolitik approach, if 200,000 people become refugees and thousands are killed or injured, but the balance of power in this part of the world is maintained, then this is the price that Kissinger feels has to be paid. That's his very cynical, whatever you want to call it, practical approach to foreign policy. Not everyone in Washington agreed. Some people said, look, we've got to do something. What we should do is we should threaten the removal of American nuclear weapons from Greece to get them to remove the officers. And we can do the same with Turkey to prevent Turkey from invading, or after the invasion, to prevent them from sending more troops to the island. This is Kissinger's response. If we take the nuclear weapons in this minor league crisis over a third-rate island, God only knows what we would have to do elsewhere. That's his assessment. That's how he looked at the crisis. But the bottom line is, and I'm going to read very quickly an extract, is that America simply, they didn't understand what Turkey was doing. This is an extract from a meeting held in Washington a couple of days before the invasion. You've got to picture a room like this. There's about 10 officials sitting around a table. CIA Director William Colby has just briefed them. He's just told them that American intelligence has identified that there are Turkish troops on the southern coast of Turkey and that they're potentially getting ready to invade. Kissinger says, well, why would they do that? Colby says, well, they probably want to move into this area. He's got a map in front of him and he's pointing to northern Cyprus. He says they probably want to establish an enclave there, which is of course what happens. There's an official from the Defense Department. He says, well, Henry, I agree with Bill's assessment, but I don't really know why. I don't think the Turks will move. I think they'll make some noise, but I don't think they're going to move. Colby then says, oh, I think they're going to avoid having to move. I don't mean to say that we think they're going to move. I think they'll try a diplomatic route first, but they may feel they have to move in the end. Kissinger, still completely confused, says, to what end? Why would they do that? Colby then says, well, their main purpose would be to establish themselves on some portion of the island to gain a foothold, which is, of course, what happened. Kissinger, still confused, says, why would they do that? Is with the ultimate objective of permanent occupation? Question mark. And Colby says, yes, that is one proposition. I could sit here all night and read conversations like this. They simply didn't understand. I know it's difficult to believe, but they simply didn't understand. American and British intelligence did know that there were troops on the southern coast of Cyprus. They did know when the ships started to set sail. The British intelligence even got the date of the invasion right. But they simply didn't, first of all, they didn't believe that even when the ships set sail that they were going to invade. Like in 64 and 67, there was a belief that they were just bluffing. And they simply didn't understand what Turkish objectives were. What was Britain's role in all of this? Well, Britain became increasingly frustrated with Turkey as the crisis went on. After the initial invasion and after the ceasefire, Turkey continued to violate the ceasefire, and Britain get really frustrated and they say, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to put a blockade between northern Cyprus and southern Turkey to prevent more troops landing on the island. And this goes quite far in the Ministry of Defence. But ultimately, Callaghan doesn't want to do this if the United States doesn't agree with him, and the United States has no interest and think this is a ridiculous idea. And this is just one example of that highlights Britain's military impotence during the whole crisis, something that Callaghan becomes really frustrated with. There is a suggestion that I've heard eyewitnesses who were in Cyprus in 1974. They observed the fact that Turkish troops were, for example, attacking Kyrenia, and then all of a sudden operations were halted. The British ships arrived. It was the summer. It was tourist season. Tourists and friendly nationals were evacuated, and then Turkey resumed its hostilities. So a lot of people thought that this proved that there was collusion between Britain and Turkey. But again, if you read the documents, what you'll see is that what happened was that the British ambassador, for example, went to Ankara and said, look, I know there's nothing we can do to prevent the invasion, but you need to help us get all these innocent people off the island. Can you cease operations, for example, for 1 hour at 2 o'clock? Initially, Turkish officials say, what, you think we're making a movie? I can't just cut, this is a war going on, there's fighting, But eventually, the British ambassador, he continues, he persists, and eventually this is what happens. An agreement is reached that at certain times, operations will cease, British ships can land, and friendly nationals can be evacuated. The other suggestion is that Britain actually somehow helped Turkish troops onto the island. Again, this is simply not true. This was something called the Megali Psema, the big lie, which was orchestrated from the Greek military. It has been admitted by Greek politicians since that it was orchestrated by the Greek military, who had realised the folly of what they'd done and needed a scapegoat, and decided to use Britain initially. So again, Britain wasn't involved in any shape or form. The overriding impression that you get is that there was simply a complete lack of understanding. Kissinger didn't understand why Turkey wasn't coming to the aid of the Turkish Cypriot enclaves in the south of the island. He couldn't understand it. This is a humanitarian intervention, he called it. Why aren't they going to the south? We obviously now know Turkish officials and military officials admitted to UN officials that Turkey had no interest in the enclaves in the south, and their instructions were to give token assistance but nothing else. But Kissinger didn't understand this. After the ceasefire on the 22nd of July, Kissinger gives a press conference where he says, this is great, we've got a ceasefire, it's great that the crisis is now over. Not understanding what would happen subsequently. After the first Geneva conference, which ended at the end of July, Kissinger disbands the Cyprus Task Force. The Cyprus Task Force was a task force created within the State Department to deal exclusively with what was happening in Cyprus. So the fact that he disbanded it at the end of July meant that he thought the crisis was completely finished. It was over. There was no contemplation that there was going to be a second phase, a second operation where 37% of the island was going to be taken. Again, I think running out of time here. I think what I'll conclude with, I'd quite like to tell you a couple of, I think, fairly amusing quotes. Because obviously I've looked at the relationship between Britain and America in all of this. A relationship that Callaghan worked very hard to try and make better. And as we see, as the crisis develops, this relationship deteriorates drastically, and there is no success in trying to get a coordinated policy at all. At the beginning of the crisis, Callaghan tells Kissinger that Britain, we have the brains, and America, you have the muscle, and together we can solve this crisis. Kissinger found this annoying and condescending, we have the brains, yeah, whatever. And Kissinger was simply reluctant to flex his muscles, if you like. It gets even more amusing when the negotiations in Geneva start, because, of course, it's Callaghan who's in charge of the negotiations, and Kissinger's watching from a distance, and he's watching Callaghan do something that he thinks he is basically the best person, he's the best negotiator anywhere. So he's watching Callaghan, and he thinks this man doesn't know what he's doing. He says Callaghan is operating like a madman. Callaghan becomes frustrated with the Turks. He becomes frustrated with their duplicitous action. The fact that they're saying one thing and doing another. He starts to threaten Turkey with negotiating deadlines. He then threatens Turkey with military action if they don't stop violating the ceasefire. Kissinger says this is one of the stupidest things I've ever heard, and Callaghan has screwed up all along. So the relationship really deteriorates. Callaghan is a bit more British, he's slightly more polite. He says, Kissinger simply failed to appreciate the situation. He didn't understand the situation. And if Kissinger had given me the tools, then we could have prevented what happened in Cyprus. And I think there is a strong argument for saying, obviously we'll never know, but there is a strong argument for saying that if the two countries had been able to coordinate their foreign policy effectively, that maybe what happened in Cyprus could have been prevented. So to conclude, I'm really sorry again to all of the people in the room who wanted a conspiracy. I don't believe that there was one. I believe that the Cyprus crisis was a failure of American foreign policy, of American intelligence. I also believe it was to a certain extent a failure of British foreign policy, although that's a bit more controversial. But Britain had responsibilities that it didn't have the influence or the power in the world to live up to. And I think Kissinger actually realizes this himself, because in an interview that he gives to Michael Parkinson in 1979 to the BBC, Parkinson asks him what he considers his professional failures to have been. And after talking about Watergate, the second thing that he actually mentions is Cyprus, and he says that he feels that the Cyprus crisis in hindsight could have been more effectively handled. And I think that's the closest you'll ever get to Kissinger admitting that he basically screwed up. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Well, Andreas, thank you very much. I think that was absolutely excellent. You covered a lot of material there, and having actually sort of read the thesis, I know just how well sourced all of this is and just how you've been through all the archives. I'd like to open up to any questions.
I'd just like to ask you to comment on an incident which suggests that the British policy was being determined by the Americans, and that's the...
was determined by the Americans.
Yeah, that's the suggestion that when the Turkish Prime Minister came to see Callahan and Wilson to try to persuade them to intervene jointly with Turkey, and of course if they had, history would have been different, because that would have been then to restore the existing state of affairs. But that didn't happen, and the suggestion from Edgevitz's account, he said he never saw two politicians who had to go to the toilet so often. In other words, they were getting their orders from Kissinger. Is that so?
Absolutely, I've read the same thing. The Turkish officials couldn't understand what was wrong with Callahan. Every 5 minutes he said he had to go to the toilet. And what he was actually doing was going over and calling Kissinger and basically getting instructions from Kissinger. You'll see that throughout the crisis, Callahan and Kissinger talk on the phone every day. I don't know, some days 20 times or something on the phone. It's very much telephone diplomacy which is going on. And I totally agree. British foreign policy is to a very large extent being manoeuvred by Henry Kissinger. I can give you lots of examples. I mean, at the United Nations, for example, initially Britain, is unequivocal. There's, Makarios is the head of state of Cyprus, and we support him unequivocally. Whereas the United States was the only country which wasn't backing Makarios, not for any sinister reason, but for typical Kissinger sort of let's wait and see what's going on first approach. But initially, Callahan says to his official Ivor Richards in New York, he says, we support Makarios 100%. And then Kissinger, who doesn't really want this thing to go to the United Nations, says, I don't like the way that you're supporting him 100%, I want you to slow down, I don't want a United Nations meeting to take place. And then you can see how Callahan's instructions to his official in New York start to change, because all of a sudden he's saying, well, we support him, but if the United States aren't that happy, then don't give him 100% support. So yeah, absolutely, totally right.
Thank you very much.
Yes, very illuminating contribution, Andreas, or Mr. Constandinos, whatever is more important. Although I disagree with the main conclusions. 3 points. The first one is related to the coup. Now, Ioannidis was the latest version of the same people, more or less, who are responsible for the 1967 coup in Greece and governed Greece for 7 years. For anyone to believe that that group of colonists and the people who cooperated with them could engineer the coup, succeed in the coup, and governed Greece for 7 years without the support of Americans, who were really in control at that time, you can't believe anything. The second point is about the invasion. The most important conclusion that one can draw is related to the meeting that Egypt had with Wilson, Prime Minister Wilson, and the Foreign Minister, Foreign Secretary. We do know Egypt asked for the permission to use the bases for the invasion. He asked for cooperation, full support, so that if it would be possible, they could have the invasion together, yes? Which, by interpretation, one can say it would be much better version than what it actually happened. But if the invasion would be the result of both, then Turkey would do whatever they liked again in the north. But the important thing is that finally Egypt asked for the possibility of invading without the British creating any obstacle to them. To that point, actually it was Callahan who said, yes, we can't do that. In other words, not creating any difficulties. That's from that point is coming out of their confidential paper, which I saw only last year. The third point is related to the relations between Callahan and Kissinger, or British-United States relations. In Geneva, it came very clearly that there were many points of disagreement. And the disagreement was not that, didn't come as a result of Washington being against Turkey. If it would be that, then it would be very easy for Callahan, very easy for Callahan. It was quite the opposite. And Callahan finally more or less played a neutral role because he didn't have the support of. I wonder your comment.
Yeah, thank you. Well, your third point, I totally agree. That's exactly what happened, as far as I'm concerned. So that's very easy. The other 2 points, obviously, I disagree slightly. As far as whether the colonels, well, first of all, the coup wasn't successful because the objective of the coup was to assassinate Makarios. And when you actually read what took place in Nicosia on the 15th of July, you'll see that it was actually a bit of a shambles in terms of how the coup was, how it sort of unfolded, if you like. So I wouldn't say it was a success. As far as, yes, the United States was the only country which did lend support to Greece. I think it's $267 million in aid, in military aid, and I don't know how many, almost $300 million in other aid was pumped into Greece every year by the United States. And even though an embargo was put in place at one point, during the embargo, the United States actually contributed more money to the Greeks than before the embargo. So you're absolutely right. But as far as American involvement in a coup is concerned, all I can say is, based on the documents that were available when I was, spent 2.5 years in the archives in Kew and in Washington, there is no suggestion at all that the CIA was involved. And as I tried to say, there is a suggestion that individual Greek-American CIA officers could have been giving Ioannidis the wrong impression, because ultimately these people were of Greek origin as well, and they may well have had the same dream of Enosis as people in Cyprus and as Ioannidis did. So there is a suggestion that they may have been involved, but there is no evidence to support the idea of a large-scale conspiracy. And I think that when you look at, for example, Chile, which the overthrow of Allende, which took place just a year before, when you look at the amount of information that is out there on that, you know, there is a lot of information on that. A lot of things have been declassified. The United States is actually fairly open, a fairly open society in terms of its information, especially as opposed to Britain, which isn't at all. I think when you look at how much information there is out there on Chile, which was just the year before, the fact that there is nothing at all on Cyprus, you know, I'm not saying it's 100% correct what I said, but based on what was out there, my conclusion, the reasonable, I think, logical conclusion is that there wasn't any conspiracy. Your second, as far as your second point is concerned, during the meeting with between Callahan and Wilson and Echevit at Downing Street, I think it was the 17th of July. Yeah, absolutely. I read the transcript as well, and that's exactly what happened. Although I don't think that Callahan actually ever says that Britain does say that they wouldn't. There would be no suggestion of military intervention or any opposition to Turkey, but Callahan still believes that Turkey won't invade. In fact, when the Turkish officials leave and they're driven to the airport, they tell the officials in the car that, you know, oh, maybe we won't have to invade. And Callahan, on the morning of the invasion, is fast asleep. He actually has to get to the Foreign Office on a milk float. Because, you know, they really didn't believe that there was going to be an invasion. Yeah. I think, I don't know if that's...
Very quickly.
Yes. The wording goes more or less like this. And it was a strange thing, because finally it was Callahan and not the Prime Minister who gave this, we wouldn't say permission, but the Prime Minister says, the British Prime Minister says, what I understand the Turkish Prime Minister wants is not to pay the difficulties.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And Callahan says, yes, we can assure here on that. I'm sure they were not 100% that there would be an invasion, but more or less it was on the basis of that they were discussing.
I would interpret that more as Britain's realisation that they were not in a position, if Turkey did want to invade, Britain was not in a position to do anything about it, rather than some kind of collusion with Turkey. That would be my interpretation of that.
I wouldn't say collusion, I would say not creativity.
Well, a couple of jumbled remarks, not on any research I've ever done on this topic. I suppose the problem is, isn't it, you know, how much smoke has to come out of a smoking gun, you know, with questions of conspiracy. You can invent endless historical problems. The origins of the Boer War through to 1974, you know, conspiracy or cock-up. And you go through the whole process, and in the end one, you know, tends to conclude it's a cock-up because you don't quite see the smoke coming out of the gun clearly enough. So that's partly going through my mind, and I was very struck by your comments about Kissinger early on, and you know, this sort of balance of power thing, which you nicely conveyed. And I suppose he didn't. You brought this out. He didn't want to know any details, and that's the thing about balance of power people. With the big picture people, right? They don't want the bloody details. And what we've learned is how dangerous that can be, how dangerous that is. But the thing I wanted to get around to asking you about, or prompting you on, is that, of course, I suppose the essential paradox of Cyprus, normally spoken about from the 1950s through to later periods, is the contradiction between the balance of power within the island, Greek superiority, Turkish inferiority, and the balance of power outside the island, the other way around. And you can never quite get the balls in the right place, can you? Because this is Anthony Eden's memoirs talks about Cyprus in exactly that way. It isn't going to get the balls in the right place. How difficult this is. You think you've got the right balls, but it slipped out of the hole and you're buggered. From Kissinger's point of view, as a balance of power person, as a systems person, to try and amend that paradox so that the balance of power inside the island is a bit more reiteration about the outside the island. Well, that's something that's rather to be welcomed, isn't it? There are possibilities there, aren't there? And so it's his complacence about this. That's where, maybe it's not conspiracy, it's complacence, and even tinged with a certain, you know, welcome to an initiative which makes things actually possibly rather easy in future for the conduct of Western American, Anglo-American, whatever you like to describe it as. That's where it seems to me the, it's maybe something, it's not quite conspiracy, but it's not ignorance, is it?
No.
It's not.
No, I agree.
It's not neutrality either, is it?
I totally agree. I actually wanted to call it conspiracy or cock-up, but my supervisor didn't allow me, so I had to change it.
Let you use incompetence.
Your comment about the fact that Kissinger had no interest in details made me think of a conversation that Kissinger has with CIA Director William Colby, where Colby's trying to explain Turkish troop movements on the island, and Kissinger just doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. He says, "Where the hell is Famagusta?" And Colby goes, "You mean Famagusta?" He says, "Yeah, I don't care." And then he goes, "What, Nicosia, is that by the sea?" And Colby says, "No, it's in the middle of the island." And Kissinger goes, "Well, do you have a map in front of you or something? How do you know all this, And Colby says, "Well, you should know it." And he goes, "Do you know what, to be honest, I don't know where it is and I don't care," is what he says. So you're absolutely right. He simply didn't care. That's the reality. And another thing I thought about when you said that he was interested in maybe readdressing the balance of power on the island is when, shortly after the invasion, Ecevit says to Kissinger on the phone, he says, we were thinking of having an influx of Turkish peasants in the north once we finished the division of the island, and we were wondering what the United States thinks about this. And Kissinger sort of doesn't really understand what he's saying, and then he says, because I think the greatest check on communism is if we have lots of Turkish peasants in the north. And as soon as he says that, Kissinger says, "Well, yeah, that's a great idea." So he welcomed that. So I agree wholeheartedly.
I think we should establish some facts here straight away, and facts that build up to the fact that American imperialism exists in a very powerful sense. First of all, and I'm sure most of you here know, that the United States officially has 762 military bases worldwide. Number one. Now let's go on to American foreign policy during, let's say, the era of when there was a conflict between the Greeks and the Turks in the early 1960s. So much so that, as you know, there was a breakdown and there was bloodshed and people left their villages and went to different places and so on and so forth. Now, 2 years ago there was a programme on BBC 4 in which they described what had happened when two British officers, one was a major, one was a colonel. The colonel was going up into the villages of northern Cyprus with a Land Rover that was full of packages in the back that had on them cigarettes, and he was going up into the villages, and he was giving these cigarettes to the poor, oppressed people in these villages who didn't have access to them, inverted commas. It turns out that this man did not have cigarettes in those packets. In fact, he had arms which he was supplying to the Turks. Number one. Number two, the major who he disappeared, by the way. You probably know the story.
Lacey, I think his name.
They never found his body, etc., etc. And we can make our own conclusions about that. Secondly, the major, he was going around, after all this furore, going around the Greek and Turkish villages and trying to reconcile them. And in fact, he was doing a very good job, and it was working.
Yes. He's sitting over
I think
there.
the Major will probably have some comment.
No, it was a British.
Yes, this gentleman here who, yes.
Well, okay. I'm glad you said it. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely right.
Correct me if I'm wrong. But on that programme, the commentator said, and what happened when George Ball, Under Secretary of State of the United States, and there he was on the island going around seeing this wonderful reconciliation that was going on, organised by the British between the Greeks and the Turks. Wonderful.
Could we hear a bit more from the horse's mouth on that matter?
And except that when he was leading George Ball to the helicopter, he tapped him on the shoulder and he said, "You're doing a great job, man." He said, "We don't want that to happen." He said, "We don't want them to get reconciled." Okay, that gives you some indication. Secondly, American foreign policy organised by Kissinger in Vietnam, 3.5 million people killed. I don't think George Ball is quite the man of, let's say, indifference that you portray him as.
George Ball.
Kissinger.
Okay. Well, what I would say is that you have to distinguish 1964 and 1974. It's in my opinion, completely different. In 1964, it's the Johnson administration, and the Johnson administration had a very different approach to Cyprus. I didn't have enough time, but I tried to briefly explain that this idea that there was a big worry that Cyprus could become a Cuba of the Mediterranean, if you like, during the Johnson administration. One of the first people Kennedy invites to the White House is Makarios, a tiny little island in the Eastern Mediterranean. The American president, probably the most famous American president, invites him. Why does he do that? Because there was a concern. And in 1964, there definitely was a plan, there was a plan to divide the island. There definitely was, there's no question whatsoever. But that doesn't mean that the same happened in 1974, and just because a plan exists, because there are plans in the 50s that Britain had to partition the island, and just because these plans exist, doesn't mean that that's what happened later, because when you look at any international crisis and you look at the way that the Foreign Office or the State Department works, they will draw up contingencies for all sorts of different permutations. So you'll have one plan for a division, you'll have one plan for this, one plan for that, one plan for that, so that when we go into the archives and we find this plan, just because we find it doesn't mean, oh look, that proves there was a conspiracy. It just proves that, yeah, they looked at that. It doesn't mean that that's what they did. And in my opinion, 1974, 1964 do have to be distinguished greatly, because there are different men running the show. There's no question whatsoever that what you said about George Ball is absolutely correct. But I don't believe that the same thing happened in 1974, and there is no evidence to support that that's what happened.
No
in
link.
I don't think so.
No policy link.
Well, of course, I mean, the policy develops over the 10 years, but you've got a completely different administration in 1974 that you did in 1964, and a different thinking and a different approach towards Cyprus. And also Cyprus has developed, because in 1964 Cyprus had only just been independent for a few years. They didn't really know Makarios. In 1964, American officials like George Ball thought that Makarios could simply be sidestepped, and 10 years later they'd learned that this man had more power and more influence than any Greek or Turkish politician that they dealt with. And this had been completely underestimated in 1964. So there's a lot of things that are quite different. And I do talk about it quite a lot in my thesis, because I think it's a very important point that you raise. But unfortunately, it's simply not enough time to address all these issues this evening.
Thank you.
Martin, did you have a comeback on this? Yes.
Well, it's not exactly a comeback.
Or a comment generally.
One or two things I'd just like to sort of add to the picture, and I think they're the things that help to create an understanding of the overlap. First of all, from the time of the Civil War in Greece up to 1974, I mean, the reality was that all of the intelligence mechanisms in Greece were controlled by the CIA. And I mean, George Papandreou, when he first came to power in '64, I mean, his major complaint, and one of the reasons he fell out with the king, was that he found that all Greek intelligence reporting from his own intelligence agencies were being monitored by the CIA before they came to him. I mean, this is perfectly logical. The CIA had set up the mechanisms there in order to combat communist influence, and they believe that they should continue to essentially to control or oversee those mechanisms. So leading on from that, the fact is that both George Papadopoulos, who was the initial head of the coup, and Ioannidis, and probably I'm only the person in this room who actually knew these guys, I mean, they both believed implicitly that they had total American support. Now, whether or not they really had or not, whether this was low level or not, the fact is that they both absolutely believed it. And certainly after the coup in Cyprus, Ioannidis said to a personal friend of mine, of course I had absolute backing from the Americans when I went ahead and did it. Now, the second thing about this, what was actually done and the execution was that this was a plan that was first drawn up, not in 1974, but in 1964. In 1964, I was asked by George Papandreou, rather by his foreign minister, Kostopoulos, if I would set up a private conduit to London, because they had decided at that point, this is December the 6th, 1964, to overthrow Makarios. They already had 10 to 12,000 Greek troops in Cyprus. Essentially was to be a Greek operation rather than a Cypriot one. But I was told by the Kostopoulos people that they had an absolute green light from the Americans to go ahead with this, and that the Americans had told them that this could be done in such a way that Turkey, would be persuaded not to intervene. The fact they did not go ahead at that particular point, I believe, is because the British government did not confer, not agree. And it was the point that I was asked by Kostopoulos if I could obtain from London a similar green light, for this to happen, the same that they had had from the Americans. This was not the sort of role that I wanted to be playing, and I actually just passed this on to another British parliamentarian who I knew would be totally against it, and therefore I think, as actually happened, the British government certainly simply did not give that green light, and so it did not go ahead then. But I think this matter of the degree to which there was an embedding of the American intelligence services with Greek intelligence services is very fundamental to the whole of this story, and I'm quite happy to believe, as you say, that this was the urging came from relatively low-level parts of the intelligence hierarchy, but nevertheless, that urging was extremely positive at that particular level, and these were the people that both Papadopoulos and Ioannidis believed that they were the right people to give them the, to give them the go-ahead. So, as far as these other items go, I think there was British complicity with TMT at various times, right from the 1950s onwards, because I think very much the British intelligence services saw TMT as a useful ally in preserving British interests in the region. I don't think there are grand conspiracies. I think, as has been the general view of yourself, that there simply was a general understanding, British and American understanding, that their main interests lay with Turkey rather than with any consideration of democratic process or independence in Cyprus. And that was very much how I was briefed in the Foreign Office in the 1960s. That essentially there were a whole raft of reasons that our policy must lie with not alienating Turkey rather than with any consideration of interests of the Cypriots.
I agree, for example, with the point that there was complicity between Britain and TMT, that the plans originated in 1964. There's a lot of evidence for that. But again, I would distinguish between 64 and 74. I also agree with your assessment of the belief that Ioannidis had, that he had US acquiescence. I think there is no question at all that he believed that, but I think what needs to be answered, the question that needs to be answered is, why did he believe that? And did the US government, was the US government involved in that in any shape or form? And I don't think it was, and I think it did come from CIA officials, and there is a lot of evidence to support that it came from CIA officials. And I think the fact that that was allowed to happen doesn't point to a conspiracy, but it points to a failure of foreign policy, that you allow this situation to develop where the CIA has exclusive access to the people who are running Greece, basically.
I'll throw in one other little tidbit. In 1974, I was asked to involve myself in trying to acquire a license for a major British group to run a casino in central Athens, and to obtain that license, one had to go straight to the triumvirate, to the top people who were then running the country, and it turned out, they said, that there was somebody else there who was negotiating for the same casino license. And this was the brother of the American president. It was Mr. Donald Nixon. He was negotiating on behalf of something called the Palm Springs Group, which was a known mafia operation. And I was told by the junta members, no, they didn't want them there because the only thing that frightened them in terms of getting rid of them was if the actual mafia got established in Athens, and therefore they would much prefer to have the Ladbroke Group, running their casino. And incidentally, what they asked for was $25 million in numbered accounts in Switzerland. They gave me all the numbered accounts, so that was 5 million or 6 million into the numbered account of the wives of each of the three senior junta members. So Mr. Nixon, had other interests in terms of getting this particular thing. But I mean, I think what that brings out was the degree of corruption and the degree to which, at the lower level, the whole process was corrupted. And I think that this embodiment of American intelligence services in Greece, was part of that corrupt structure.
Yeah, Donald Nixon was one of the many American officials that visited Greece during the time of the junta, and the only country that sent any officials to Greece was the United States. So, but I didn't know about the casino story. So. you don't find that in the archives, unfortunately.
The other criticism, you were talking about Tom Papas. Of course, the great story about Papas was that the funds that he was channeling to Nixon were actually CIA funds, because Papas was a major recipient of. Major receiver of CIA funding. He was part of their the process in which they ran their operations in Greece.
Voilà.
Thank you. Thank you for that talk. Extraordinary amount of information. And there's actually cacophony going on in my head now with everything that you've said.
That's how I felt for the last 3 years.
Here's my question. Okay, there's no conspiracy. But we have 3 guarantor powers who are signed on the dotted line for the benefit of this Mediterranean island. But on the other side, we're hearing they didn't know, they didn't believe. Quite frankly, it sounds as if they probably didn't care too much at the time. With all that, and with the same players in this theatrical piece, what hope do we have for Cyprus finding a solution if everybody is still putting in their penny's worth? And if so, what is it going to be?
How long have you got? Open the can of worms.
Yeah?
God. Well, as far as the guarantor powers are concerned, obviously, Turkey was one of the guarantor powers. They had their own ideas. Greece was basically struck off the guarantor power list by Turkey and Britain because of what they'd done. And Britain, I'm not just saying it because I was born in this country, but Britain really Callaghan did try to play the role of the honest broker. But he was basically impotent, if you like. He simply didn't. Every time he tried to do something, he was blocked by all sorts by the Americans, most notably, because, as I tried to say at the beginning, he didn't believe that that British foreign policy could go down a route which was opposed to that of the United States. So every time he came up with something, he was on the phone to Kissinger and say, "Well, we're thinking about doing this. What do you think?" And Kissinger would say, "I don't think that's a very good idea," and that was the end of that. So as far as Britain, I think that would be my one criticism of Britain, is that, but I think James disagrees with me on this, is that Britain shouldn't have been a guarantor power, basically, because being a guarantor power was implicit in that is that this country has some kind of power, some kind of influence, and that it can actually do something when the situation arises. And Britain simply wasn't able to do that. Didn't have the influence, didn't have the power in the world, had no influence in that part of the world, in Greece and Turkey. The only country that did was the United States. And the United States, for many reasons, had no interest in putting pressure on Greece and then putting pressure on Turkey, which is the only way I think that the invasion could have been prevented. As far as a settlement for Cyprus is concerned, I don't know if I should go down that route, but I think I've become very passionate about Cyprus, especially in 1974, and I've become very passionate about what hasn't happened in the last 34 years, and I think it's a real tragedy. But I don't know. I think there needs to be some education because of my German background, I compare Cyprus and Germany, and when I go to Cyprus now and I speak to people my age, I find that there are a lot of parallels with post-war Germany, where talking about the Second World War was a taboo subject and you didn't talk about it, and therefore people didn't know anything about it. And I think this is a big problem. And in Cyprus, when you talk about 1974, either people are not interested because it's too controversial, they don't want to go down that route, or they simply don't know. I'm not saying what I've written or what I'm saying is 100% accurate, but I have an understanding, and I think it's sad that it's not taught at schools. From what I understand, it's only very briefly touched upon. I think this is a major problem, and there needs to be a real education on 1974, because if you don't understand the past, then it's very difficult to move forward in the present and in the future. So I think that would definitely need to happen.
Gentleman here.
Yes, well, Dr. Constandinos, first of all, many congratulations on completing your thesis, and you work hard, and you should now taste the fruits of your labor. I've got two questions / comments that maybe I'd like your opinion about. I mean, you mentioned how America was interested in pleasing the junta in Greece. How about then pleasing Turkey? And it was at least an equal geopolitical power in the region, with proximity to the Soviet Union, actually neighbors to the Soviet Union, to Georgia there, and also proximity to Israel. And I'm talking about 74, 1 year after the Yom Kippur War. So the Arab nation is still looming there. There's a possibility of another war, and obviously Israel, the most important ally of the United States in the region, needs somebody strong in the region. And obviously Turkey is the obvious ally. So how about, I don't know if you found anything in your sources, just the United States trying to please Turkey, even at the expense of Greece. And my second comment is, obviously you've talked about the clarity and transparency of your sources, especially in the States, and how transparent they were about Chile. But how about if, for the case of Cyprus, an ongoing problem that still affects the relationship between Greece and Turkey, which even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the position is still quite important in the region. How about, for the sake of just keeping the balance right in the region, they maybe conceal some of the sources or they don't make them public? And as such, we cannot really have a complete, all-rounded picture about the story and the problem.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Yeah, the first question, I think you're absolutely right. Kissinger's approach was very much, step back, let's see what happens, and if this side is the one we should be backing, we'll back this one, and if this one is in US interest, then we'll back this one. And at the beginning of the crisis, or before the crisis, it was very much, don't upset the junta. And then when Turkey became involved later on, it was very much don't upset Turkey, because as you said, Turkey was geopolitically indispensable as far as America was concerned. They had lots of bases in Turkey, which are very important. Kissinger talks a lot about the fact that a country like Turkey, where we have all these bases, it's okay to upset them a little bit, because then they'll still let us use the bases. But if we really upset them, then that causes us a problem, because then they might refuse us access to the bases. So he was very aware of that. What you say about Israel is interesting, because the American ambassador in Turkey, in Ankara, actually said that when he was given the post as the American ambassador in Turkey, he was told that America's relations with Turkey were more important than America's relations with Israel. So there was a belief within the Foreign Service that Turkey was the biggest ally. Also, what is quite interesting, I'm not sure how relevant it is, but just before the crisis, America and Turkey having some problems over an opium agreement that they have. About 70% of the opium that's grown in Turkey used to find its way via Marseille to the United States. And a lot of congressmen were very unhappy about this. So they used to pay Turkey millions and millions of dollars to not to cultivate opium poppies. But when Ecevit came into power, he thought, this is ridiculous. I don't want the United States telling me what to do. So he rescinded the agreement, and they'd started cultivating again just a month before the Cyprus crisis. And so the relations were very frosty. And it does appear in quite a few documents that, you know, they're saying, well, already relations are a bit rocky. We've got to be careful. We can't upset Turkey too much because, you know, already, you know, relations are a bit difficult. So absolutely right, Turkey was incredibly important to the United States, and that was the reason why Kissinger didn't do what, the only thing that he could have done to prevent an invasion, i.e. send a letter like the Johnson letter, or make a threat, or make a military intervention, something like that. There was no way he was going to do that, because Cyprus, as far as he was concerned, was simply not important enough to upset an important, a crucial ally like Turkey. As far as your second comment is concerned, you're absolutely right. There might be a document somewhere sitting in Washington or in Kew which is released in 10 years' time which says that everything I've just told you is complete and utter nonsense. I have no control over that. Also, as you heard, I'm a lawyer by trade, so my disclaimer for this talk would be that what I've said is based on the information that was out there, and I looked at every single document that I was able to. I made many Freedom of Information Act applications. I saw a lot of documents which other people haven't seen. And what I've said to you this evening is based on that. And you're absolutely right, there are still lots of documents. In America, there are lots of documents which have a 50-year rule, or in Britain as well. And there are lots of them still there that I wasn't allowed to see, and that you'll have to wait a long time to see. Henry Kissinger has an agreement with the Supreme Court in America that a lot of his documents won't be released, I think, until 5 years after he dies. So we're still waiting for that, obviously. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
We're rapidly running out of time. I'm going to take a couple of questions. Yes, I'll include it. Mary, did you say
yes,
you had
please.
one? And then is there, if anyone else wants to ask a question, can they sort of just, any hands? Okay, so I think it's just those two questions. Mary, if you go first.
Okay,
Yeah.
Andres, congratulations on finding that Partition quick. I thought that it had been lost for all time, because I actually watched the programme. For the conspiracy theorists that want to stay conspiracy theorists, do you want to just say something about Davis and how he died? Because I don't know about that. And also Tasker, actually.
Yeah, okay.
Is there any plans to have this published and translated into Greek and Turkish, and very quickly? And what would you say to Hillary Clinton if she becomes Secretary of State to try and compensate for what Kissinger didn't know?
Okay. All right. Roger Davis was, I don't know if anyone knows, Roger Davis was the American ambassador in Nicosia, and he was tragically killed during an anti-American, anti-British demonstration which took place in Cyprus in August 1974. There is a suggestion that he was assassinated. The official story is that it was a bullet that was fired at the embassy and it ricocheted and it killed him, and it also killed a Cypriot lady who was working in the embassy. But there is a suggestion that he was deliberately assassinated, and that there are politicians in Cyprus who actually know the people who committed the murder. So I think that's what Mary is talking about. And Henry Tasker, who was the ambassador in Athens, he died a few years after the crisis in a car crash. And there is a history in Greece of people dying in car accidents who other people want to get rid of. Sorry?
Have you seen the way they cry?
Well, I think it was on a mountain road as well. So, but I don't know. That's a little bit something for the conspiracy lovers. Yes, I would love to get it published. Do you know someone who wants to publish it?
I think there's several. I mean, after tonight, I think we should be getting it published.
I hope so. Yeah, that would be great. So if anyone knows any publishers out there, please let me know.
And translators.
And translators, yes. You want to translate it into Greek, maybe? Anyone who wants to translate it into Turkish, please come and see me afterwards. Yes, please.
And Hillary Clinton, if she becomes Secretary of State?
Well, it's quite interesting. There is a quote in Claude Nicolet's book, which a quote from Bill Clinton, where he actually sort of apologises for American foreign policy in Greece during the 60s and 70s to a group of...
Can we have an apology from Hillary?
Well, her husband's given an apology. Does she always do what her husband does? I'm not sure, but yeah, he apologised in 1999. So,
well, could we have an apology from him when he visited Vietnam when he was president? He didn't say to the Vietnamese people, "I'm terribly sorry for killing 3 million of your people during the Vietnam War?
Just very briefly, before the crisis of Cyprus, there was a crisis in June between Greece and Turkey, again, a serious crisis, dealing with another island. Do you believe there was a linkage, or...?
I think what that proved was that there were many attempts to remove Makarios, and from what we can see in the archives is that on every previous occasion there was some kind of agreement in place between Greece and Turkey, because relations between Greece and Turkey were fairly good. But when Ioannidis came in, took over the junta, the indication from the documents is that he had no interest whatsoever in any kind of relationship with Turkey, and relations deteriorated drastically. He used to give any official that came to see him a history lesson about Byzantium, about Constantinople, about 400 years of Turkish oppression. Even if they came for a completely different reason, he would sit them down and he would just give them this history lesson. So he had a pathological hatred of Turkey. And there was no way that this man was going to have any kind of a prior agreement with Turkey. Whereas we know that with Papadopoulos, for example, he did have agreements. So in 1972, when there was a plan, a similar plan to overthrow Makarios, there was an agreement. Turkey knew exactly what Greece was planning to do, and Turkey had said, you know, they were going to stand back and allow. There wasn't going to be an invasion. But in 1974, the indication is that there wasn't an agreement because Ioannidis, he didn't want to speak to Turkey. He hated Turkey. He didn't want to speak to Turkey. So I think in that sense there is a link to the problems that existed in the Aegean. It just highlights the fact that relations between Greece and Turkey were so poor at the time, and they were the worst, arguably, that they had been since 1967, when the Greek military came into power in Greece. So yeah.
Well, Andreas, thank you very much for a fantastic talk this evening. I think it's really been absolutely fascinating. I think you laid out a very clear way through this. I know that obviously some in the audience are going to,
of course,
contest what you've said very strongly. But as I say, I think no one else has gone through the evidence in quite the way that you have. You've obviously done an enormous amount of work, and I think you're to be congratulated on it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.